everyone. For folks who are joining, we're going to get started in about 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Federal Leadership for Relocation of Coastal Communities in Response to More Severe Storms and Rising Seas. We have a wonderful program in store for you today. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. I want to give you a warm welcome to today's event, and thank you for joining us. We so appreciate your time today. I also want to give a huge thank you to our fantastic speakers who put in time to prepare a great program for you all today on an important topic. Thank you so much to our speakers for their time and energy. There will be time at the end of today's event for questions, so if you have any questions at all, please put them in Zoom's Q&A box. You do not need to wait until the end of the webinar though. Please submit them as soon as you think of them through Zoom's Q&A function. Should you have any technical issues during the webinar, please message me, Sarah Biken, or send me an email at calhoun@eli.org. This event is being recorded. The recording will be posted on ELI's website within a couple of business days. Additionally, there was a read ahead document emailed out to you if you registered in advance. It is available on ELI's website, as well as the slides from each panelist's presentation. And with that, I will hand things over to our wonderful moderator, Jeff. Jeffrey Peterson joined ELI as a visiting scholar in 2022 after 40 years of experience in environmental policy and development and program management, particularly focused on water issues. Most recently, he was senior advisor in the EPA's Office of Water, and before that, he worked for almost 4 years at the White House Council on Environmental Quality during the first Obama term. He's also the author of A New Coast, Strategies for Responding to Devastating Storms and Rising Seas. I'm going to hand things over to you, Jeff. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Madison, and welcome everyone. Our goal today is to provide you with an overview of the challenges that the federal government faces as it works to provide a framework for programs and policies to support relocation of coastal communities. This work is called for in the new Biden administration Ocean Climate Action Plan, which addresses coastal resilience generally, but also includes several actions for federal agencies specifically addressing the topic of relocation. So today's webinar is divided into 4 parts. I'll give a short introduction to the problem of coastal flooding and rising seas. Each panelist will then give a short presentation describing their work on climate change and coastal management, including relocation. Then the panelists will respond to some general discussion questions. And finally, we'll take some time for questions from the audience. So before I introduce our panel, I want to just quickly summarize the key points to keep in mind during the webinar. The Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, and Pacific coasts are home to over 100 million Americans. The population living right along the coasts at about 33 feet of elevation is expected to double by 2060 to be over 44 million people. Climate change poses a significant risk to coastal communities through the combined impact of more severe storms bringing temporary flooding and permanent inundation from rising seas. These storms and rising seas also threaten coastal ecosystems, beaches, and wetlands, as well as major critical infrastructure assets that provide essential services, such as transportation, energy, and water. Coastal storms are a major risk to life and property, and these storms can deliver surges of over 15 feet of high water. A warming climate is causing an increase in the number of the strongest storms, which bring more extensive coastal flooding, higher storm surges, and increased rainfall. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has recently issued new estimates of future sea level rise, concluding that the rate along the coast is accelerating and is likely to rise as much over the next 30 years as it has over the last 100. Sea level rise averaging as high as 1.7 feet around the coastline is possible over this next period to 2050. That's in the high scenario, and could reach as much as 2 feet in some places, such as the Western Gulf of Mexico. And by the year 2100, NOAA projects sea level rise along the US coast averaging about 4 feet in their intermediate scenario, with an average increase of as high as 7 feet being possible. And finally, sea level will continue to rise for centuries, even after 2100. More severe storms and rising seas bring economic, environmental, and social disruption to coastal communities. And it will be really an unprecedented scale. All or parts of hundreds of coastal communities will face far more extensive flooding than they currently experience. As sea levels rise, sunny day flooding will increase and gradually lead to permanent inundation. The combination of more severe storms and rising seas is projected to result in potential losses of coastal property running into the trillions of dollars. Many low-income and disadvantaged communities are among those in harm's way. These communities are disproportionately affected by climate change, including sea level rise and extreme coastal weather events, and often lack the resources to respond to these risks. 3 strategies to address coastal storm flooding and rising seas are widely recognized: structural protection, in other words, bulkheads and sea level and seawalls; elevation, in other words, raising structures and supporting infrastructure above floodwaters; and relocation, in other words, moving people, structures, and supporting infrastructure to higher, safer ground. Structural protection and elevation strategies have been applied in many cases to protect homes and communities in response to temporary storm flooding. Relocation involves movement of structures and is generally considered more controversial, but a better solution to the permanent inundation that comes with rising seas. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, writing at its sixth assessment, concluded, quoting here, "Only avoidance and relocation can remove coastal risks for the coming decades, while other measures only delay impacts for a time, have increased residual risk or perpetuate risk, and create ongoing legacy effects and virtually certain property and ecosystem losses." In the new Biden Ocean Climate Action Plan, which addresses coastal resilience generally, there's also some attention to this topic of relocation and several specific actions for federal agencies to undertake. The plan calls for federal agencies to support community-driven relocation demonstration projects, to develop an approach for sharing government-wide resources and information to support community-driven relocation effectively, and to align policies across agencies to support socially cohesive community-driven relocation by developing programs that provide incentives and support communities interested in relocation. The Ocean Climate Action Plan identifies federal agencies to lead this work and general timeframes. The White House Council on Environmental Quality is directed to play a key role in coordinating the work of these agencies. So this webinar really is an attempt to give a forum to experts from diverse disciplines, an opportunity to provide suggestions and other input that federal agencies and others might find useful as they begin implementing the relocation-related tasks identified in the Ocean Climate Action Plan. I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel with deep knowledge of these challenges. I'm going to introduce them all up front, and then we'll have their presentations. Micah McMillan is a senior analyst in the Natural Resources and Environmental team at the Government Accountability Office, where he's worked since 2004. Micah's work focuses on climate change, water infrastructure, and the impacts of energy production on water quality. Recently, he has written reports on climate resilience and migration of communities. A.R. Siders is faculty in public policy and geography at the University of Delaware, a core member of the Disaster Research Center and director of the Mangone Climate Change Science and Policy Hub. She studies climate adaptation, ethics, creativity, and relocation as an adaptation response. She was a contributing author to the latest IPCC assessment report and to the US climate assessment. Linda Shai is an assistant professor at the Cornell University Department of City and Regional Planning. She studies how urban land governance practices and policies shape climate vulnerability and the equity impacts of climate adaptation responses. She chairs the task force on climate change for the American Collegiate Schools of Planning. And Gary Griggs is a distinguished professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at UC Santa Cruz, where he's taught for 55 years. His research, teaching, and writing focus on natural hazards and coasts, both in California and globally. In recent decades, his work has emphasized climate change and sea level rise, how these are impacting coastal nations, cities, and populations around the planet, and responses to these challenges. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to start presentations, and we'll start with Micah McMillan.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks Madison, Sarah, and the rest of the staff at ELI for the opportunity to present GAO's work on climate migration. For those of you that are unfamiliar with GAO, we're an independent, nonpartisan legislative branch agency that provides information to Congress and the general public on ways to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the federal government and help save taxpayer money. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of GAO's work on climate change and disaster resilience. Every 2 years, GAO issues the high risk list, which is a list of federal programs and activities that are high risk due to their vulnerabilities to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or that need transformation. Federal fiscal exposure to climate change was added to this list about a decade ago, and it initiated much of our work reviewing the federal role in enhancing the nation's climate resilience. So GAO's work on climate resilience examines the federal government's role as the leader of a strategic plan, as the owner and operator of infrastructure, as the insurer of property and crops, as a provider of technical assistance to decision makers, and as a provider of disaster aid and resilience assistance. Next slide, please. Our recommendations related to climate resilience generally fall under 2 categories: mainstreaming and creating new institutions. So mainstreaming or integrating climate resilience into federal programs and operations. And then as far as creating new institutions, it's generally designed to address large scale projects like climate migration that pose challenges larger than any one agency can handle. Next slide, please. In 2019, we also published the Disaster Resilience Framework to help federal agencies and policymakers identify actions that can facilitate disaster risk reduction and climate change resilience, and also analyze existing federal efforts to identify gaps or opportunities for improvement. The framework emphasizes three key principles: access to authoritative and understandable information that can help decision makers to identify current and future risks and the impact of risk reduction strategies; integrated analysis and planning that can help decision makers take coherent and coordinated resilience actions; and incentives to make long-term forward-looking risk reduction investments more viable and attractive among competing priorities. Next slide, please. We only identified a handful of communities that have actively considered climate migration as a resilience strategy when we started our work in late 2018 on climate migration. From these communities, we selected Newtok, Alaska, Santa Rosa, California, Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Louisiana, and Smith Island, Maryland, based on geographic and demographic diversity, as well as the diversity of potential climate impacts. And at the time, only Ile-de-Jean-Charles and Newtok had decided to move forward with relocation because their climate threats were considered imminent and existential. For example, Ile-de-Jean-Charles has lost around 98% of its land mass since the 1950s due to sea level rise, storm surge, unsustainable oil and gas production practices, and other factors. And at the time of our report, the Denali Commission projected that Newtok would be uninhabitable within the next few years due to thawing permafrost and coastal erosion. And by late 2022, storms had eroded roughly 40 additional feet of land between the Nenlik River and the community school. And our report found that federal programs provide limited support to climate migration efforts because they're generally designed to address other priorities. And because no federal agency has the authority to lead federal assistance for climate migration, support for climate migration efforts have been provided on an ad hoc basis. As a result, federal programs don't have the scope, scale, or level of continuity necessary to assist communities with migration efforts. Next slide, please. And so as a result, little is known about how federal programs should be changed or if new programs should be created to assist communities with migration. And based on GAO's previous work, project management best practices and recommendations from the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, pilot programs can be an effective tool to test new policies and assess lessons learned before scaling them up to the national level. And as a result, we recommended that Congress consider establishing a pilot program with clear federal leadership to identify and provide assistance to communities interested in relocation. And I just want to add that, sort of since the report was issued, the Biden administration has also created a community-driven relocation subcommittee to sort of examine the federal role in assisting with climate migration and relocation. Next slide, please. Our report also identified some key factors to consider for decision-making on climate migration. So the first is community-led planning. Socioeconomic, cultural, and political connections to a geographic region may be strong, making it difficult to consider migration as a resilience strategy. Community-led groups that facilitate effective strategic planning can expedite progress and build public support for climate migration. Also, moving an entire community requires technical expertise that many local communities do not have. The overall cost of these communities can be prohibitive, and communities will need to pull federal, state, and local funding from programs with differing requirements and selection criteria. And also, funding decisions are often made by different agencies at the federal and state level, often with differing priorities, while zoning and planning decisions are made at the local level. Whether a community decides to remain in place or relocate, there needs to be coordination and agreement across all levels of government. And also, one thing that we noticed was sort of the difficulty in providing services in both the prior community and the location where the community is being relocated to. And generally this is caused by a loss of revenue, which can impact the community's ability to provide basic services. as it migrates, and it also impacts the receiving community's ability to develop the capacity to provide services to the migrating population. This was a particular concern in sort of low-income areas similar to Newtok and Ile-de-Jean-Charles. And as communities relocate, they will need to be in a position to provide basic services in both the receiving and migrating communities. Okay, next slide, please. So as we start thinking about this on a more strategic level, we're going to need to consider how you can integrate climate migration with other climate resilience policy needs, including government-wide climate change strategic planning, development of a national climate information system, expanded use of climate change economics for decision-making, a mechanism for prioritizing climate resilience investments. GAO recently released a report called Climate Change, Summary of GAO's Work on Federal Climate Resilience Projects, that kind of provides a good overview of this. And it will talk about a lot of the reports that are listed here and sort of some of the recommendations that GAO has made in these different areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, we recently issued 2 reports examining the federal government's support to help Alaskan Native villages address environmental threats and the distribution of financial aid for through COVID-19 emergency relief to tribes. We identified a number of barriers to accessing federal programs, including several barriers relevant to climate migration and disaster resilience. Next slide, please. The first one is, consolidating applications, deadlines and reporting requirements, and waiving cost sharing helped improve tribal access to federal programs. Providing federal agencies with statutory authority to transfer funds to other agencies that had established relationships with the communities helped streamline delivery of federal support and assistance. Additional spending flexibility and longer spending timeframes helped communities better address their specific needs, leading to more efficient use of limited federal funds. Sustained federal and interagency coordination that spans administrations is critical to effective long-term planning for climate resilience and migration. And expanded federal technical assistance is particularly important to help communities that lack technical and administrative capacity navigate federal programs and requirements. And so thank you, and back to Jeff to introduce the next speaker.
Great, thanks. That's a great overview. GAO's done some fabulous work on this whole topic, and that was a great summary. Thanks. Next up is AR Siders.
Hello, thanks. Really excited to join this conversation and appreciate it. But I want to start with sort of maybe two provocations, I guess. And the first being that as we're having this question about federal relocation and the role the federal government should play, I really do think we should keep in mind, why is it a federal responsibility? And I want to reflect on that because I think there's a lot of different types of relocation happening across the US, and we should be clear about the types and why different types would require different types of government intervention and different structures, right? The relocation of entire tribal communities has a very different structure to it than the relocation of a neighborhood in New York City or a rural community away from a river. And so, we need to think differently about how that is going to work. And I think about this because I work a lot with rural communities who are thinking about moving away from a river. And in that reaction, those communities are moving 5 miles, maybe not even 5 miles, right? They're moving within state, within the same county, within the same school district. It's all about state roads, state schools, state land use policies. So the role for the federal government is going to look very different in a kind of relocation that looks like that. And some of the questions that have come up in the chat just along this way, the different words we're using in this space. But we're going to say relocation. You're going to see I use managed retreat. So we're going to talk about that. There's climate migration. Right? There was a question about why it's not coastal migration. Just these words do have different meanings, right? So when we think about relocation, we're often thinking about a group of people, like a whole community relocating together. And that requires, in my mind, relocation requires both a from somewhere and a to somewhere else. Right. And most of what the United States does in reaction to these giant risks is that we help people move away from a floodplain, but we don't help them decide where to move to. And that's actually a big challenge with a lot of the way we're doing relocation or retreat in the United States. And it's one of the reasons I say retreat rather than relocation, is because we're spending a lot of time on the from and not as much time on the to, with the exception of many of the tribal community relocations that Micah was just describing and that are ongoing. So anyway, one of these things is whether or not it is a federal responsibility. And so I just wanted to start with this quote from the Congressional Research Service, right, which says, generally agreed, government should help disaster victims, but it's debatable whether that should be a federal or a state government. And I'm just going to reflect that opinion changes a lot over time, and that people are having a big debate right now about what is the level of federal intervention that we should see. The other thing that I'd like to keep in mind is that we should think about here is that, oh, maybe I've gone too far. Hold on, let's see if I can get back. Yeah, is we're talking about climate relocation or climate-induced relocation, disaster-induced relocation, and we should really be asking ourselves how that is different from other types of relocation that have happened in the past, right? So HUD has been running a Move to Opportunity program in the past. They're running a Move to Work opportunity right now. So there are federal programs that help people relocate right now for non-climate reasons, but we should really be taking a look at those programs and thinking about why those lessons don't apply in this context, or as I think they do, often they do apply, and what lessons should we be learning from those other contexts, right? And then this is a picture of Youngstown, because that's sort of the classic Rust Belt starting town, but I was just recently on a camping trip of towns that have been abandoned and have relocated and have moved in Pennsylvania. And so it's worth remembering that these places have, like, this kind of movement has happened a lot before, and we're probably going to see it in the future. And so the question is, which Linda Shai, who's going to speak in a few moments, that said so eloquently at a recent conference, which is that we want to do better than this, right? These things have happened in the past and we want to do better. And so that's why we should have this conversation, but we should keep in mind that this isn't something that has never happened before. This type of relocation has happened all throughout history, and we should keep in mind those lessons learned so that we can do better than those. And so just thinking about that, right, like relocation isn't new. So these are some of my favorite old examples from the United States from the 1800s, right, 1850s, 1888 on Coney Island, Niobrara, Nebraska. I love it. They built themselves as the town too tough to stay put. They moved twice. Actually, they relocated once, realized they weren't far enough from the river, had to relocate the entire town again. And I will just note that the federal role in all of these relocations was nothing or next to nothing, right? Brighton Beach back in the day was very privately funded. The relocation of those homes on Long Point, Cape Cod in Massachusetts, right? Individuals floated their homes onto the mainland. Niobrara, the town relocated. The federal role in the Niobrara example was to ignore a request to move the post office until 5 months after the relocation had happened. So, the role was very limited back in the day. This was primarily a state and a local responsibility. And then we only actually start seeing this shift in the early 1900s and the 1950s, right? We get the first federal aid in the 1950s. So this is a relatively recent development that the federal government should have anything to do with disaster response and anything to do with this kind of relocation, with where people live, with how this housing develops. And we see that shift happening more and more the further we get into the 1900s, right? We see the federal government providing funding for relocations, as in Valmira, Illinois, Pattonsburg, Missouri, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, towns that have relocated away from primarily rivers in the US, which is one reason we think about climate migration rather than coastal, because there's a lot of riverine flooding happening here. But the role was still fairly minimal, right? And to the point that there isn't a single federal government here. The mayor of Valmira, Illinois talks about having to work with 26 different state and federal agencies to make that relocation happen. So yeah, there's definitely a role to be done to have that coordination happen better, right? To not have to have 26 one-off negotiations and then iterations on those conversations and play the telephone game all the time. There's definitely a role to be doing better there and coordinate that. And then we get buyouts, of course, which are not really relocation. As I said, they're not a from here to there. They're just a don't live here. But I don't want to undersell them because they are a big program in the United States, right? They have been used in every single state in the country. So FEMA ones have been used almost every state. And then between FEMA and HUD, we cover every single state in the country. And the numbers work out that it's almost 1 in 3 counties in the United States that have relocated homes out of a floodplain. So this is something that the United States has lots of experience with, but lots of experience with that we are not talking about and we are not learning from. And so the real challenge is, how do we learn from our past experiences to do better now? And Winslow, Nebraska is up there just as an example, because they're a town right now that wanted to relocate. They talked about relocation. You can see they're very flooded in that example. Their town population is shrinking because people are moving on their own without any support in an unmanaged retreat. But the state actually does not allow them to relocate because that is not an authority that is given to towns to relocate. And so this is actually an area where, as I mentioned, it's not clear what the role for the feds is because the state has already made a decision about that relocation. And so I love that we're having this conversation about the feds, but I just don't want us to forget that the states also play a really big role here and probably should play a larger role in what they're happening. So all of which is to say that this is changing a lot over time. Oh, keep going too far. Right. And we're getting an increased role of federal government over time to the point now where when disasters happen, people always, I'll get journalists calling up and saying, well, why didn't FEMA give aid? And the answer is because it's not a federally declared disaster, right? Because that's a disaster that should be handled by the state or the local government, and it is not being handled by the state or the local government. And that's the problem. And the fact that state and local government is not handling it, on the one hand, could mean that the feds need to step in. On the other hand, maybe it means that we should be pressuring state and local governments to handle disasters that do not rise to the level of a federally declared disaster. And so there's a big debate about this, right? That debate over whether it is the federal or state government should have primary responsibility here. This is the figure to me from one of those GAO reports Mike was just mentioning that really explains why we need more of this conversation, right? You can see that between 2009 and 2018, FEMA money has helped about 43,000 households mitigate their repetitive flood loss. So properties that are flooded over and over and over again. Right? But over that same time period, we get 64,000 new repetitive flood loss properties. And so you can see that that bar chart is going up to the right, right? The problem is getting worse over time. And so we are not doing enough and we are not doing enough of the right things, I think, to handle this risk, right, to reverse that trend. And so this is one of the reasons we talk about retreat, is because retreat is the major way that those people who have had their properties helped, 83% of those 43,000 households have been helped through relocation, through buyouts or other acquisitions. And also I mentioned that we're putting more emphasis on the feds, and this is just one of those things that sticks with me, is that between 1960 and 69, we had an average of 18 federally declared disasters a year, but in the 2000s, we had 57 federally declared disasters a year. That means that there's more than one, and if those were spread out evenly throughout the year, we would have more than one major disaster declaration a week. Right. And you can see on that chart up there from the congressional reporting system, right, that those numbers are often very much higher than 50 a year. And so there's a lot of factors going into that. Of course, it's climate change, but it's also development and costs. And it's also just an increasing reliance on federal aid to do this. And so we need to do something much more drastic to make those numbers come down. And so when I think about what that is, we can think about whether we need a big increase in a federal role or a big decrease in a federal role. And there's pros and cons on either side. There's a lot of good arguments on this. One of the major challenges, though, in increasing the federal role is whether an increased federal role will come with increased federal authorities to handle things. They don't currently have the authority to do so. So for today, because we want to talk about what the federal government can do, I decided to go back to Basics 101. So I went to Bardoc's Practical Guide to Policy Analysis, right? What do governments do? And so here's, what governments do, right? Taxes, regulations, they handle rights, they work on subsidies and grants, they provide services, they do information and education. And frankly, the federal government could be taking action, and most agencies could be taking action in all of the above categories, right? So I won't walk through this table. The slides will be provided to you. This is not a comprehensive table by any means or by a long shot, right? This is just thoughts I had while putting this together. So, but there is a role for the federal government in every single one of these levels to think about a managed retreat, or you can replace managed retreat with relocation if you prefer, context in terms of how they could be supporting this, right? And some of the big ones, I think, are in thinking about how the government provides incentives for state and local action, how the federal government can streamline its processes to get out of the way of state and locals, right? So there aren't 26 agencies that have to be coordinated with, and so there aren't duplicate papers being submitted to HUD and FEMA on the same program to provide the same process, right, that have to be duplicated. So how can we streamline those processes to get out of the way? But then how can we align the financial incentives so that there's a financial incentive for state and local governments to take action and to do something much more radical about mitigating risk in the long term? Because right now there's far more emphasis on the recovery than on the mitigation. And then, of course, there are other things in terms of building capacity. And we often think about building capacity at the state and local level, and that is absolutely needed. I argue particularly at the state level, because I think we overlook the role of the state government in providing technical assistance, to local communities. I don't think it's feasible to ask FEMA or HUD or EPA to work with every single community in the United States. I think it makes far more sense for them to work with states and then states to work with their local governments and be able to tailor them in that way. But there's also a big need for federal agencies to build their own capacity. Someone was asking about the Uniform Relocation Act. The number of times that I hear local governments or state governments complain that the person they're working with at a federal agency does not understand the Uniform Relocation Act, has applied it inappropriately. And then we have to spend 8 months of lawyers getting involved to find out that, yep, the federal person was wrong because they didn't understand the technical issues involved. It's not a big deal, right? People get these things all wrong all the time. It's a complex area, but building capacity can also mean that if someone is going to provide technical assistance or grant oversight at a federal level, they need to understand the laws and the technicalities that go into that, because otherwise they are being a block to the process as well. So building capacity within these federal agencies is also really important. And then I think sharing practice and lessons learned, right? There is a FEMA document from 2011 that contains 160 examples of towns that have relocated neighborhoods, towns that have done buyouts, towns that have done acquisitions and created green space. They're just little one-pagers on here's what they did, whether it worked or not. It is not the evaluation I wish it were. I wish there were much more of an evaluation there. I wish there were a lot more of those shared lessons learned. But almost no one knows about or uses those examples or leverages them or learns from them. And I think that's a real shame, right? There's a huge effort here to be learning from what 1,200 communities have done, what 17 communities have done in terms of community relocation. And right now we are reinventing the wheel every single time, and that has to stop. The last thing I want to leave with is that one of the big things is any engineers on this, you know, wild WAG as a wild something else guess. So it's a wild ass guess, right? But I would like to suggest that instead what we really need for federal relocation and to have a framework for federal relocation or support, federal support, I would rather say federal support for community or state relocation is we need some wildly ambitious goals, right? And wildly ambitious goals, I literally have a photo of putting a man on the moon here, right? Because I think that's the level that we need, a wildly ambitious goal. Because our ambition level can't be, how do we maintain the status quo that we have today and spend the least amount of money to deal with climate change, right? It has to be something very different. We are not addressing the scope of the challenge ahead of us. We are fiddling around on the margins, and we need to do something much bigger. And I think that starts with what would wildly ambitious adaptation or hazard mitigation look like in the United States? And until we have an answer to that, I think we are never going to hit the mark of where we need to be. So I would say that is the first and biggest challenge, is to have a wildly ambitious goal. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you. That's great. And I think we're all thinking, that's where would we take a wildly ambitious goal? And with that thought in mind, I'll hand the program over to Linda Shai.
Thanks so much, Jess. Siders and I don't have this plan, but we actually tag team really nicely. So thanks so much for setting up my talk. I don't have slides because I'm on a 2-week road trip, not to abandoned communities, but maybe to communities we should think about retreating from. I'm in coastal Maine and my family's at the beach while I'm doing this. So you'll just have to watch my face while I deliver my remarks here. I think that if I put forward a wildly ambitious goal, at least from a governance perspective, I would say that the federal government really needs to issue a national climate adaptation strategy. As part of that, a national spatial adaptation strategy. And so right off the bat, somebody was asking, can the federal government just make some of the land use changes? At the federal level, we don't have land use powers and controls. And so in this context of a very federated, deconcentrated government, it is very challenging to put forward some of these big, ambitious strategies because our land use is fragmented by states and then also by sectors. And so I think there are some really tough questions that we are not yet asking because we don't have the political will to ask some of these difficult questions. And yet we have the climate science on the one hand, and then the realities of how we're governing on the other. And even though our national climate assessments tell us very difficult facts, we don't then enact what is the implications of that fact for us. So when the national climate assessments tell us about sea level rise in coastal communities, or the increasing heat that we're seeing right now this summer, or the wildfire risk and the drought and their implications on food security, on water supplies, on human habitability, those have direct implications for where we can live and grow and sustain life and food systems in the future of this country. But that doesn't yet translate into what we can really do. And so even that is a spatial question. Spatially, what can we do? What is the future of this country? And then also temporally, what does that mean for our country? So we have, the Biden administration has done more on this than any other administration. We have these sectoral plans, but all these sectoral plans in the end land in a specific place, and we don't have any strategy that tells us what is it when the DOE and the BLM and FEMA and HUD and DOT, and they are all saying something different. What happens when they all land in a specific place? So as a planner and as a profession that thinks about space, that's a really fundamental question that I would like us to consider. So the federal government in the past, as on the last slide, I don't think Siders specifically mentioned it, but the slide shows the national interstate highway system. So there are these moments, I'm sorry, I'm in a family relative's house where they still have old phones that actually ring in the house. So you might hear that in the background. But we'll have these moments in the past where there are major federal interventions, and the federal government doesn't control land use, but it controls land use through infrastructure. So it has these moments where it has done the New Deal. It has done the urban renewal. And urban renewal, for instance, was chiefly a policy that was a Cold War response. I think many of us have forgotten this now, to deconcentrate our cities in case a nuclear bomb is dropped on one of these cities. So how do we help deconcentrate these cities and create the interstate highway system that can help diffuse populations and create suburbs so that we are not all in one place? They had these incredible imagery, renderings of the day, like if Hiroshima happened on top of New York City, what would the rubble look like? How much would it be felt in different radial circles? And so that was a plan. And so we have these moments where in the past, the federal government has undertaken leadership and through its existing authorities implemented very large initiatives at a very rapid pace. But those initiatives have never been in support of really sustainability or of equity. In the chat, we talk about some of these tribal relocation programs and how devastating those are. So we have had relocation instances, but very often they are not equitable. And so the challenge now is, how do we do better? How do we actually achieve this kind of scale of the challenge, but actually build in sustainability and equity and justice at the basis of that? Our chief approach, as far as I can see in the Biden administration and in the ocean policy that Jeff mentioned in the beginning, is that we are saying it'll be equitable if it is community-led. And that's how we are going to achieve fairness and justice. And I think that is such an important approach because so many big federal interventions in the past have been problematic, but it is far from the only thing that the federal government can do in order to achieve justice. And I would argue that if we only enable local community-led efforts, we would actually not be helping communities achieve that goal because there are many other initiatives. For instance, as Siders noted, it is impossible to talk about retreat without talking about where you want to advance towards. And that, because the federal government and state governments have abdicated that particular land use role and vision, that means that private entities, the market is very much filling that space. When you talk to insurers, lenders, bond rating agencies, speculative developers, they are very much modeling just where would be the safe and most resilient places that we can go. And that, as Jesse Keenan has written, is a complete black box. We don't know what standards and metrics go into that or how trustable those standards are, but they fundamentally are going to shape the entire environment in which local governments can bond to make investments, the price of housing, how much your mortgage is going to be, whether you can obtain insurance and for how much. And that is a national, international scale effort that if we do not address and intervene in is going to affect all communities, including disadvantaged communities. Right. So if we think about a spatial plan, and I don't mean this to say it, there are some countries like China that do a great deal of spatial planning and that have national land use powers and that it can be very scary and not necessarily have the best outcomes. But at the same time, using the controls that the federal government has, how should it think about where it deploys infrastructure investments and subsidies of all sorts across all of these different sectors? Where do we want to grow in the long term? What is that going to look like? If we want to sustain life in Arizona and Texas and California, what is that going to entail? Can we do that if we build enough seawalls? If we don't build the seawalls, what is going to happen? These are things that our science can help us answer, but they are fundamentally going to be not only science-related goals, but they are political and policy-related goals. So I think that in terms of infrastructure policy, we need to be thinking about where do we want to grow and have a spatial perspective. So right now, our $1 trillion of federal investments are not necessarily spatially have any kind of thesis attached to that. If a local government applies with a very thoughtful grant, they are eligible to get that. Whether that investment means creating a bulkhead or things that, as people in the chat are noting, are not sustainable in the long term, that is an approach. It can go in Florida. It can grow in any particular place. Is that the kind of vision that the federal government wants to deploy? That is part of where its choices and policies is going to shape local planning and policy. A lot of attention has been paid to individual household level migration choices. And research that was just published this year by Jim Elliott and Zheyi Wang showed that for those who have taken a buyout, on average, they move 8 miles. So that is a very localized set of policies that's going to affect local land use. But if we're talking about business relocation, then that is the main driver of where people choose to live is for jobs. At what point is there going to be businesses that say, I need sufficient water and secure climate in order to maintain a supply chain or my workforce or whatever else? Where are we planning the future of development and growth? In the past, we have steered development in different ways to the Sun Belt, to the West, to the South. And that is something that we have also, again, no spatial current thinking in terms of that. The chief thing around, I think, equity and justice is about housing. So climate justice is about housing justice and access to affordable and safe housing. And I think this is clearly an area where at the federal level, we need to demonstrate greater integration between these agencies if we are expecting local and state governments to do the same. So HUD and FEMA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all of their policies, I think there is much more opportunity to understand just how much housing stock are we talking about potentially being impacted? How much is that going to exacerbate existing affordability crises? Of what kinds of housing are we going to be losing or have threatened to lose of naturally or in subsidized forms of housing? How much more are we going to produce? In which types of places? In what formats? Should it be cooperative housing? Should it be mobile homes? Should it be community land trusts? And how can we do that in ways that are actually equitable and just? I'll close with 3 things that I think are essential then for the federal government to achieve these issues. One is to pay attention to the private sector and what they are doing, and to make sure that a public perspective or a justice-centered perspective is part of the conversation. We have so many people advocating for justice, and then we have completely separate conversations behind closed doors for the big financial industries, the fire industries that control basically how we do development in this country, and they are not at all having the same conversation. So how can the federal government actually bring those voices together in order to push and advocate for justice-centered and community-centered approaches to some of these fiscal financial policies? Some of the conversations we're having now about retreat and withdrawing infrastructure, that's going to have a really devastating effect on local governments and communities if we simply withhold infrastructure funding. So at the very basic level, and we can get into this in the Q&A, at any metropolitan scale, there are municipal governments that are very land constrained and tax constrained. So if we want them to make different choices, we need to be incentivizing their ability to make governance changes to which kinds of tax policies do they have. CITER's listed like town mergers. New Hampshire is the only state that has allowed town mergers and different kinds of consolidation due to coastal sea level rise. Is that the kind of thing we want to incentivize and encourage creativity in as we roll forward $1 trillion of money for infrastructure? And finally, as Siders also noted, there is such a need for institution building. Already, it is very obvious that having $1 trillion flow out, municipalities and local governments and states are really struggling to be dealing with so much additional flows of funding. So in order to do that in any way that is creative requires longstanding institutions that can develop relationships with each other, that can learn over time. And so where we've seen buyout programs that have been standing programs rather than something that develops only after a federal disaster declaration, you see that they are able to do much more thoughtful and effective policies. And even then, they are still struggling in certain areas. So the 2021 BRIC funding, 4% went towards capacity building, 87% went towards actual implementation. So if we want people to do better work, we need to actually invest in creating the kinds of integrative, collaborative institutions at federal, state, and local levels in order to do that work. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Linda. And our final concluding panelist is Charles Griggs. Charles, turn it to you.
Thank you, Jeff. I think we're ready to move on to the next. Okay, great. Well, first, sea level rise is real. It's now and it's everywhere. When I see this picture, I'm not sure whether they've adapted parking meters to boats in Miami or not, but these problems go way beyond Miami. And if we look at, let's see, I'm having trouble shifting this. Let me try this again. I'm supposed to have control here.
You can just use the keys on your keyboard if that's easier.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do. I think we skipped a slide, but we'll go on from there. So can you go back?
It should go back if you use the left arrow key on your keyboard, or I can take control back over the slide.
I think you probably ought to take control. This isn't working. Can you go back one more? One more. Somehow we skipped many ahead. Okay, so next slide. These are all the things you're not supposed to happen. Next. So beyond Miami, we've got issues of sea level rise in every city and county around the West Coast, the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and globally. Next. Pacific Coast, however, has some different issues than the West or than the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast, in part because our coastline has a very different geologic history. So we've got cliffs and bluffs that are eroding, but we also have low-lying areas. So we have two different kinds of issues here. Next. Next. So over the short term, until probably at least mid-century, whether it's the East or the West Coast, we're going to have more problems with short-term extreme events. In the East Coast, it can be hurricanes. On the West Coast, it can be high tides, El Nino events, and high tides combined with large waves. This is one place on the Central Coast in the middle of summer. Next. Next. And this is a few months later. So what was a low-lying community on the coast, this is not sea level rise related, but it's simply extreme events. So if we look at the options we have for sea level rise, really mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're already doing some of each. The more mitigation we do, greenhouse gas emission reduction, the less adaptation and suffering will be required. Next. So Jeff listed a few options in the beginning. I'm going to use a few different, but one of them is ignore or deny sea level rise. And this is a position that has been taken by some individuals, some states. Over time, this is not going to be very effective, to say the least. We now have really good records of sea level rise over 150 years, and also the fact that it's accelerating. Next. Along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast, rarely on the West Coast, beach nourishment has been a sort of a primary way of dealing with shoreline retreat and sea level rise. Next, this is very expensive and it's very short-lived. And if we look at sort of the history, particularly the Atlantic coast from New Jersey to Florida, we put in well over 1.4 billion cubic yards of sand since the 30s at a cost of $11.5 billion. Florida in particular, over 500 nourishment projects totaling the equivalent of 33 million dump truck loads of sand. 15 different beaches have been nourished over 15 times each, and Palm Beach has added sand 51 different times. This may tell us that it's not working very well, but we keep doing it. And a strong recommendation here is to get the Army Corps of Engineers out of the business of nourishing and renourishing beaches. This is a short-term and, again, very expensive solution. Next. The approach along much of the West Coast and areas along the Atlantic coast is armor, whether it's seawalls or revetments or bulkheads. This is also very expensive and it has major shoreline impacts. And every seawall or revetment has its limits. We learned that in New Orleans with Katrina. You can only build a wall so high, and with future sea level rise, those heights are going to be exceeded. Every engineering structure has its lifetime or its endpoint. Next. Recently, the Corps of Engineers, next, has proposed a number of major walls around coastal cities. How they selected these cities, I do not know. How they selected these projects, I don't know, but these are just 4 that have come out in the last couple of years. These are multi-billion-dollar projects, and I think this raises some really important questions. Why are they the ones deciding this? How do they decide which cities to protect and which sections of cities? How much protection will they provide over how long? Who's going to pay for it? Do people want to live behind these barriers? And what other options should we consider? And what other federal and state agencies should be involved in this process? Next. So those are the 3 options that historically we've used. And I think in the long run, it's important to recognize there's absolutely nothing we can do over the long term to hold back the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. Everything we've talked about so far is very temporary. So in the long term, we have to adapt. We can mitigate, but we are going to have to adapt because we're not going to stop sea level rise from occurring very quickly. Whatever we call that, managed retreat, managed realignment, community-led relocation, ultimately, we're going to have to move back from the shoreline. We cannot stop the oceans from rising anytime soon. Next. So cities have never had to deal with sea level rise before. As human civilizations evolved, the coastline was a good place to build, and we went from villages to towns to cities to megacities. In the US today, there's about 13 million people living within 6 feet of high tide. That's a level we could reach by 2100. And it's the same globally, only there's far more people living very close to sea level, very close to high tide. Next. So I believe responding or adapting to sea level rise will be the greatest challenge human civilizations has ever had to deal with. And if we look at the amount of sea level equivalent contained in the ice of the planet, there's about 216 feet. We do not need 216 feet, however, to create disasters along the shoreline. And this is just from Climate Central's surging sea site, where you can go anywhere and put in 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot of sea level rise above high tide. This happens to be San Francisco International Airport. There's the runway. So with 5 feet, which we could reach easily by 2100, SFO goes underwater. It actually starts to happen at about 2 feet. They are now considering a 10-mile long seawall, hopefully that would provide protection till about 2070 or 80. It's going to cost about $550 million. Next. Most of our airports around the US were built out in the water, over the water, because that's where the land was available. This is Newark, and you can see the runways of Newark. This is with 2 feet above high tide. Next. And LaGuardia, which also just 2 feet above high tide. We could have that by 2050, 2060. So we don't need all that ice to melt, but the rate we're going, it's going to happen fairly quickly. And these are common for our coastal airports around the country. Next. So it's one thing to move a village, to move a town, to move a few houses, but when we look at places like Miami or these airports around the country, how do we accommodate sea level rise? How do we deal with 3 feet or 5 feet of sea level rise when we look at places like Miami Beach? Next. So some recommendations regarding these issues for the federal government. One is to completely restructure the federal flood insurance program to have premiums reflect actual risks. And this has been something that's evaded every administration forever because of political pressures. This is still a highly subsidized program that goes into debt virtually every year. We have to end that. The private insurance companies have realized this and are now no longer going to insure properties in high-risk areas. We need to get the Army Corps of Engineers out of the business of nourishing beaches at very high cost, but very short lifespans. And I think in terms of the walls that have been proposed around big cities or a few, we need to get other federal agencies involved. NOAA, the U.S. Geological Survey, who's the science behind this, around the wisdom of building these walls and how long they'll last and who's going to pay for it. Next. To the degree the federal government has a role beyond those that have already been discussed, rather than assisting neighborhoods to retreat or realign, I think the most appropriate priorities would be public infrastructure. These are high-cost situations that serve many people: airports, railways, highways, wastewater treatment, and so forth. Buying out coastal homes, in my view, is going to involve astronomical costs, because in many cases, these homes are owned by wealthier individuals and are often second homes. Next. I'm just going to give you example of one community on the sand in California, Malibu. These are just 4 homes for sale, virtually on the sand, and you can see the prices. This is not where we should be spending federal tax money. So I think this is not a priority for the federal government. Next. And finally here, I would just say we have to think about what's really involved in the short term and long term, which is mitigation, and understand that sea level rise, climate change, and burning fossil fuels are intimately connected. The longer we wait to respond, the more difficult, the more damage, and the more expensive it will be. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gary. So that wraps up our panel presentations, and I want to thank all the panelists and move us into the general discussion part of the webinar. We have a couple of questions we're going to share kind of among the panelists to get their impressions and reactions. And the one I'd like to start with is this question that is raised in the IPCC report's comment on relocation, which mentions the notion of avoidance as a strategy, meaning avoiding further development in places subject to coastal flooding and sea level rise. And that would have the effect of helping to reduce the number of structures that ultimately need to be relocated at a future date when there's an inundation problem. So do you all agree that avoidance should be part of the relocation discussion? And do you have suggestions for the federal government as to how it might help states and local governments to steer new development to places that are not at risk of flooding and rising seas?
I agree completely. And while all the discussion that's gone on about what the federal government has, their role has been or has not been, I think by making the federal flood insurance program financially sort of viable, this becomes a really important issue. We don't want to encourage more development in full of flood prone areas because we're just going to have to bail them out again and again.
Yeah, so I feel very strongly about this. I'm working with two colleagues actually right now in Miami and North Carolina on looking at land, how much development has occurred in the floodplains across the United States. We're just actually this morning revising that paper. We're going to submit it. So I don't know, we'll link it once it's once it exists, but you know, the pace of academia. But they found that over the last 20 years, we've built something like 2 million acres of new development in the floodplain, and that's not quite 1 million homes, which I love that almost half of those are in Florida. Right, so new homes in the floodplain are occurring around the country. But the other thing that we're finding in a slightly different study is that looking at local governments doing this is that a lot of local governments, in fact, are doing well. Right, they're not putting massive new developments in the floodplain. So it's kind of this tale of two cities, right? The places that are not doing well are doing really, really, really not well, and the places that are doing well are doing okay. Yeah, and so it does suggest that we need to target our efforts at the places that are not doing well. But you know, as Linda mentioned, we don't have a federal land use authority, right? So this isn't something where the federal government can go in and say, don't build in the floodplains, right? That's not something constitutionally that we allow in the US. So in my mind, the role of the federal government here is really to change the financial incentives around local land use, because what we find is that the towns who are doing well, they are using basic laws. They are using some zoning. They are using some building codes. They're just enforcing them. So the key is like the towns that want to do well have all the tools they need to do well. It's the towns that want to do that and are willing to do that. And so the issue here is not like we don't need a whole bunch of set of new tools or new authorities, or at least that's what we're finding. It seems to be that we really need to just create some incentives and maybe some capacity, right? Maybe this is a role for some model ordinances and for some education about how places are doing this well. But it's really about getting the will for towns to do this.
Anyone else like to speak to the avoidance topic? Let's take another question. The discussion mostly so far has been on communities and homes and businesses. But of course, the coast has critical ecosystems, beaches, wetland systems, and lots of major infrastructure that provides services that people rely on that's really at risk. Gary mentioned airports in particular is one good example of a major critical infrastructure that's often found in low-lying places. And I wonder, so far, we haven't seen a lot of coordination between thinking about how managed retreat or relocation of homes and buildings in a community scale might be coordinated with the same sort of thinking about, well, how do we protect the beach or the wetland that's nearby? How do we protect the interstate highway or the airport or the water system, major infrastructure? Do you all have thoughts about how the federal government could encourage a more coordinated look at how relocation would affect not just communities, but ecosystems and infrastructure?
Sure, we just did a paper that I'll pop in the chat when I'm done talking, looking at the way in which we think about that question with respect to buyouts. And so buyouts are, the chief policy, at least on the FEMA end, is really to reduce fiscal risk and health of people. So it's to reduce the liabilities for NFIP and to get people out of harm's way. There's nothing in there that says that program is actually trying to create resilient, healthy communities and landscapes. So I think a chief thing is, if that's what we want to get, then that needs to be what the policy goal is actually stated to be, and then have everything move towards that. So anything from like a lot of BRIC funding still cannot be used for post buyout restoration, or like a lot of buyout funding cannot be used for restoration efforts. And so you have these programs that reduce property tax rolls and then ask local governments with their reduced capacity to be in charge of restoring landscapes. And that's just something that is unlikely to happen. As well, with a lot of bio programs, the implementation unit is often not one that is able to understand, like is familiar with restoration efforts. So there's a divide at the local level as well between those who are dealing with land use permitting, housing development, and then the risk reduction of flooding, and then site restoration. And there is no requirement or capacity, as I said, institutions that they are all talking together and working together to make something that's allows you to do that. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity in changing the policy framework at the national level and institutions at the local level, so that we actually do create that as a possibility. Because one could also imagine that, we think of it as being people and land, they're just healthy separately. But actually, when you look at any place that is doing well, people and their landscapes, their health and their cultures and their well-being are really integrally tied, whether it's indigenous or non-indigenous places. People have place attachment, people have ties to place. So if you were to say and create a program that says, we have a vision for what we want to restore towards, what we want to go towards, your sacrifice of leaving is going to make it something that is going to be more beautiful and more healthy. And when you move, on average, 8 miles away, if you want to still be part of the stewardship and care of this place and maintain ties to it, you can. That could be something that also encourages more people to participate in something that right now is very much about loss and sacrifice and harm. And so one instance of that is that when Carrie Hewlett did, and colleagues did a lot of these interviews with people who actually did move away, almost always people come back to the places that they moved away from. They care about what happened to that. And it may not have made them not relocate had they known it would be restored or not, but certainly it helped them heal if they saw that this land was moving ahead in a good way. So I think there's a lot of room for integration there.
Great, thank you. One topic that a number of you all have touched on is the challenge of environmental justice. Relocation strategies, really like other coastal flood resilience strategies, can be poorly implemented and result in unfair treatment of disadvantaged communities or homeowners. Are there steps the federal government can take to strengthen social justice aspects of relocation projects? You often hear mentioned problems with cost-benefit analysis and the way it's applied sometimes in coastal projects that would focus, for instance, less on high-value property and more on people.
Well, let's see. So it's a huge effort, right? Because right now that would require some congressional change in the language, because most federal agencies are required to think about cost effectiveness in certain ways. But I think it's worth pursuing. And I'll just say one alternative that Louisiana has been pursuing in their coastal master plan is that they are moving from an estimated annual damage, so dollars of damage that they're projecting out, towards an estimates of number of structures and types of structures that will be damaged. And they're trying to use that, right? So instead of saying, let's build a levee where there will be $1 billion of damage, they're saying, let's build a levee where there will be 1 million people, right? And that's at least slightly more equitable in terms of, right, how are we thinking about that? And in some places it doesn't matter, right? Because like if you have a dense urban area, it probably fulfills both of those criteria. But in some places you'll see a difference, whether it's a dense population like residential neighborhood or a business district, right? And so having that difference I think is important. So just offer that as one, I think, nice step moving ahead. And then of course there are developments that have been happening in the cost benefit analysis themselves, thinking of this move, right, of like thinking about environmental benefits, including equity and things like that. But I think there's a lot more to be done here in terms of thinking about it progressively. And I think moving away from property damage dollars is probably a good start to the extent that agencies can, and then pushing Congress where they can't. Yeah.
I just want to add, I think that Siders is dead on. I just want to add that I think that the technical assistance piece is going to be critical here. It's not even like sort of, developing like sort of stronger economic tools that build in, climate change considerations and risks. It's getting away from this sort of like, pay to play with a lot of the federal programs and finding a way to create the capacity to make those accessible, because right now, and this is more systematic across the entire government, not just in the space, like it's very, very difficult for most of these communities to take advantage and to pull the resources they need to like sort of do these big projects. And until that changes, we're going to struggle. And like Sider said, it's going to require some pretty massive statutory changes. So.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to that, like, we did a project recently where we talked to, 30 some buyout practitioners, right? So they're running relocation programs in across different states and whatnot. And I will just say that every single one of them had a wait list for people who wanted to be bought out and haven't been bought out, right? So are like actively want to be out. So we always talk about the people who don't want to leave and are being forced out, and we should be really concerned about them. We should also be really concerned about the people who want out and are not able to get out because they are being forced to be exposed to floods over and over and over again, right? Or to face massive economic challenges. But all of these practitioners also told me about towns nearby where people wanted buyouts, but that they were unable to do so because they lacked the local capacity, right? They didn't have a planner who could handle the grants. They didn't have a local match to cover the cost. They didn't have whatever it took to get involved in that relocation. And that's just for buyouts, which are the low hanging fruit, right? For a community relocation that requires so much more engagement, so much more effort, right? If you can't even get capacity to apply for an existing program to get funding for buying up 1, 2, 3, 10 homes, you certainly aren't going to have capacity to deal with a whole community relocation. And so I just wanted to offer that, that I think, we don't know because I don't think we have a systematic idea, but my sense from these practitioners is that the appetite for relocation is actually larger than we think in many places. And we don't have the infrastructure to meet the appetite that we already have, much less the what's coming. So yeah, Mike, I just wanted to follow up on your capacity building point, because I think that's so critical.
And I think, Siders, you're exactly right. I mean, I think that's the whole thing. We're trying to pull resources from programs that are like, already like spread thin, that they can't meet the demand that's already there. I think about it in the water infrastructure space in particular. There are like the SRF programs, they have massive backlogs in terms of projects they need to accomplish to just meet the basic mission. We're not looking at forward-looking climate change considerations, like talking about moving infrastructure or hardening infrastructure for climate change. We're talking about just basic, like, environmental goals like set out in the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. So, it's good. When Sider says it's going to take something like something, transformative, she's not wrong. So.
Okay, let's move quickly to take some audience questions. There are a ton of really great questions in the Q&A, and we won't be able to get to all of them, sorry to say. But maybe a good segue from the discussion about technical support and capacity. There's a question here. On the coastal front, do any panelists have thoughts on what should be amended to the Coastal Zone Management Act to address climate and equity issues raised today?
Briefly, I don't. I think it's a really interesting prompt, and now it makes me want to go find some law school students who could look into that. But I don't know, and I think that's actually an interesting avenue. Is, you know, I'm surprised often, I guess, like living in a state that's entirely coastal, right? Like how rarely we talk about the Coastal Zone Management Act as a way to think about coastal planning or as a way to think about coastal resilience. So we use it primarily to think about like offshore wind or beach access or wildlife habitat, but we haven't been thinking about it, I think. At least I haven't been engaged in any of the conversations that are using it in that way. And so I think it's a really interesting prompt.
I just put a paper in there. I think this is a great question too. I don't know the CZMA well enough, but having read Caitlin's paper that I just put in the chat, she assessed like all the coastal states, and there's just such a variety. Even though all these states are participating in CZMA, they themselves adopt a wide range. So apparently the CZMA allows you different states quite a great deal of latitude. So for instance, in Florida, you can build anything. You want to fill that, you want to do beach renourishment, you want to build a bulkhead, you can do any of those things. In much of New England, a lot of that is not permitted. And I think maybe beach renourishment is one of the things that most states actually also allow. So there's a great deal of variation on that. But I think to the point of one of the earlier things I put in is like maybe the not subsidizing or not investing in infrastructure and not providing federal funding can be hugely powerful. So Siders often says, before you retreat, stop advancing in the wrong goddamn direction, I think is your actual terminology. Some general said this maybe. So I think that that's a key act in action on the federal government's part.
Yeah, Linda's right. And I think that we just have to get out of the business of being enablers, you know, and at least from my perspective, like the things that I look at, that starts with the NFIP, and it also starts with the federal crop insurance program, you know. Are we continuing to subsidize things that are just like exacerbating this problem? So.
Yeah, I obviously agree. I'm like, yeah, stop going in the goddamn wrong direction. But like, thanks for calling out my tendency to curse during these presentations too, because it's so insane that you just can't, I don't know, I can't keep a civil tongue in my head. But you know, these also raise really important equity considerations, right? Some of the questions in the chat and the Q&A have been about equity, and I haven't typed in answers because they require like a whole other panel. But you know, they really consider deep problems about equity that we are not as a country prepared to discuss. Like, you know, the relative merits of relocating a vulnerable group, right? And so on the one hand, don't want to target vulnerable groups or organizations or relocate them or displace them, right? And on the other hand, the inequities of keeping vulnerable populations in areas that are known to be vulnerable and known to be hazardous, where they're going to experience repetitive flooding and the right long-term wealth problem, like generation problems that come with that. And so, you know, we don't have a good systematic way to think about those issues or to deal with them, or to engage communities in communities making those decisions. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done here on the explicit equity implications of divesting, not investing, investing in different areas, all of it, right? And part of that's just going to be making it a really explicit part of the conversation.
Well, sort of following up on the equity question, there's a question in the chat. There's a perverse thing going on when homes are damaged, e.g. a hurricane, and people move away. Eventually, the property values go up. The reason developers build bigger and fancier homes at the same spot, that's driving up the property, I think is what she's saying, property values. That should be prohibited. What to do? How can we deal with that? Thoughts or questions, suggestions?
Sure, I'll start that. I think it, first of all, depends on which agency is funding the relocation or the buyout program. So for FEMA buyouts, you cannot build on that again unless it's for sort of minor, you know, recreational uses. But if it's a HUD buyout, then you can rebuild on it. And the HUD one actually also requires that it take place in certain limited income low-income areas. So that gentrification effect is particularly likely. Sometimes because localities or states don't want to lose the tax dollars. You know, New York City after Sandy put forward its program. Cuomo's program was to relocate people permanently. And then Bloomberg said New Yorkers don't retreat. So his program that he put forward did allow people to rebuild. So it can be extremely disruptive to have very confusing different policies on this front. But there is also the effect that even if you were not to relocate and just talk about investing in infrastructure, like a lot of the Biden emphasis on 40 by 40 is to put infrastructure that is going to protect communities in places that are considered more disadvantaged or structurally marginalized. And that can also contribute to gentrification effects because now you're living in a place that is much more resilient and the property values will likely go up as well. And so I think we haven't seen it quite enough to, some of it can be, there are a few studies that try to measure the effects of that. So we haven't seen it quite play out, but that's just an understood dynamic. And so the question then is, what can we do to prevent that, right? Chiefly, the thing that we want to do is not to not invest in low-income communities. We want to do all of that. The problem is, A, there is not enough affordable housing. B, that wages are too low so that people can't afford any housing that is out there. And C, that the ways in which we own land, which is single individuals, does not allow disadvantaged communities to have the powers of scale and collective response to withstand market pressures. So if you want to know, evidence is very clear that community land trusts and cooperative housing is very effective in countering gentrification, but those kinds of housing systems are not well supported in any of our legal, institutional, financial lending policies and insurance policies. So for instance, the Stafford Act explicitly says that it cannot be used to support the condominial collectively owned parts of co-ops and condos. So you can fix the inside units of your building, but in your elevator, your basement, your parking, your exterior, the Stafford Act would not support that. So these are just like, basic things that I think the federal government could certainly change, and past legislative efforts that have tried to change that have failed. So.
Great, thank you. I think we have time to squeeze in one more audience question. And here's a question from pretty current events question, really. Any thoughts or perspectives on how the new FEMA program for community disaster resilience zones may affect community relocation and retreat? FEMA just closed the comment period on public input to how it should implement the new law with respect to community disaster resilience zones. So anyone given thought to how the disaster zones might affect retreat?
Sounds like ciders to me.
This is gonna be another one of those I don't know questions, right? Like, I mean, okay, I guess I'm willing to say I don't know. I don't know. So I've seen just a little bit about this discussion, right? So on the one hand, identifying any places being particularly at risk could contribute to relocation or retreat because it could further depress housing prices, because it could just inform people about their risk level, right? It could lead to that. On the other hand, this is going to be based on the National Risk Index from FEMA, so that already exists. So in theory, people have already, that has already taken place. So my understanding is that this isn't like I don't know. So I'm a little unclear, and the designation seems to be this is an areas that will get priority access to funding, but it's unclear to me whether that means funding for relocation or whether it just means funding for anything, right? Funding for elevations, for nature-based strategies, for armoring, I don't know yet, because I don't think I have a good enough sense about what funding sources they will get access to. But please, others with more detail or have read more on this.
Well, I think we'll all look forward to seeing how FEMA chooses to respond to all that comment and where they go with their guidance for implementing the risk zone idea.
I will maybe just one thought on that is, like, I think sometimes there's a hesitancy to identify places as being particularly at risk, because there can be pushback on, oh, that will depress my property values, or that might lead people to want to move away or not live here. And I think that might be true. On the other hand, I do want us to think carefully about what that means, right? Because the more we tell people about the risk, the more we are being honest with them so they can choose what level of risk they want to accept or can accept, right? The alternative is that we purposely conceal information that we think would be critical to their housing choices, and we hide that from them so that we can artificially increase property values. I just want to be really clear about that, right? When we choose not to disclose risk because we're concerned about property values, we are in effect lying to people in order to maintain property value. And I think that should be a real concern. So I just want to like put that out there before that argument gets said that I think that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think a consideration about long-term viability has to be there. We can't keep putting a Band-Aid on things, you know, and maybe they are prioritizing it based on risk, but are we having the hard discussion about whether this community is going to be around in 25 years, or at least like in its current form? I mean, it's
Okay,
callous, but
I
it's the
think
truth. So.
We're pretty much at the end of our time here, and I want to wrap us up with, first of all, a big thank you again to all the panelists for great presentations and lots of helpful discussion. Also want to thank the Environmental Law Institute for sponsoring the webinar and doing such a great job of helping us get logistically together. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining on the webinar and look forward to further discussions of this important topic. Madison, did you have any closing comments?
Yes, thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, Jeff, Gary, Micah, Linda, and Siders for joining us today and for giving such informative remarks. We truly appreciate your time today. Thank you as well to our audience for tuning in. The recording of today's webinar will be posted to the event page on ELI's website within a couple of business days. As a reminder, you can also find the pre-reading and the panelists' presentations on our event webpage right now. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.